Mist coils around the stone circle like a waking serpent, slow and ancient. The heather whispers as if remembering something it should have forgotten long ago. Dawn has not yet risen, but the earth exhales a breath both damp and heavy, as though it carries the weight of thousands of names that no longer live in mouths. Somewhere beyond the moors, a raven cries once. Then silence. A boy stands barefoot on the moss-slicked edge of a dolmen, his red hair tangled with sleep, eyes still clouded by dream. He does not blink as the morning deepens. He is not waiting for the sun, he is listening. To the stones. To the ravens. To the blood that stirs in his wrists. He does not yet know the story, but it lives in him. Beneath his ribs. In his teeth. In his shadow. Long before ink ever kissed vellum, the Celts carved their truths in water, in fire, in flesh. They did not separate the world of gods from the world of men, they bled into each other. A warrior's scream could summon a goddess. A woman's weeping could shape the wind. The soul was not contained by the body, it wandered, it shifted, it returned. In those days, the land itself breathed myth. Luth the long-handed, who held a spear of unquenchable flame. The Morrigan, crow-winged and terrible, weaving ruin with her hands. Bridget of the eternal flame, whose name was spoken in both blessing and lament. But for every god remembered, 1,000 mortals were forgotten, their fingers calloused from weaving, their bellies knotted with hunger, their songs fading into the hum of spinning wheels. A girl in a woolen shift once lit a fire at Beltane and whispered her brother's name into the flames. He had vanished in the marshes, taken by something, or someone, who walked softly in the mist. Her mother said to let it go. But the girl could still hear him in the reed songs. And so she sang too, believing he might return on the wind. Her voice was never written down. But it was heard. By the bog. By the birds. By the gods. This was a world of oaths and omens. A broken will foretold betrayal. A red fox seen at dusk meant blood before the harvest. Ropes hung over doorways were touched 3 times for luck, or for mercy. In the dark of a winter night, one might wake and find a handprint on the lintel, black with ash, not human. These signs were not feared, not exactly. They were understood, like grief, or rain. In the high glens of Ulster, the warriors painted their faces with lime and hollows of deer blood. But in the valleys, where the cattle grazed and children tended coals, the real battles were quieter. Women who bound wounds with moss. Elders who remembered the old paths through the cursed woods. Fathers who sat up in the cold, waiting for sons who never returned from raids across the sea. It was not just a mythos of heroes. It was a mythos of silence. Of waiting. Of sacrifice without witness. And still, the stories moved. Like light through smoke. A child might be born with a call, and the village would hush. For such children saw both worlds. Between the cries of geese and the flicker of torchlight, they would speak truths they could not know. A name, buried. A sin, hidden. A death, not yet come. And then, they would fall silent for years, as though remembering exhausted them. We speak now of Celts as a people, but they were not a nation. They were a memory woven into language, scattered across isles and forests. In Gaul, they chanted in moonlit groves. In Britannia, they vanished into mists with iron still red in their hands. In Hibernia, Ireland, their blood ran deep, into the very peat. No border could hold them. No empire could fully erase them. And still, they were hunted. Not by blade alone, but by forgetting. The Romans came with roads and crucifixes, with gods who looked like men. Later, the bishops arrived, bearing books and bells, offering salvation that smelled of wax and fear. They named the old gods demons. They burned the groves. They cut the tongues from women who dared speak to rivers. But the Celts did not vanish. They shape-shifted. Luth became a saint. Bridget was reborn as a nun. The old symbols slipped between the lines of holy texts, a boar drawn in the corner of a psalter, a triskelion hidden in stained glass. Even as they knelt before crosses, they still buried horses with the dead. Still lit fires at Samhain. Still left milk at the threshold for spirits they claimed no longer existed. And in every generation, there were those who remembered, not in words, but in knowing. A shepherd alone at dusk might hum a tune his grandfather sang, not realizing it once calmed storm gods. A midwife might wrap a newborn in a spiral of cloth, unaware it mimicked the coil of the sacred well. A soldier might see a crow linger on the battlefield and feel cold in his bones, though the sun was warm. These moments, small, unnoticed, were where the myth survived. In a forgotten glade, far from road or chapel, a stone still stands with no name, no inscription. Children fear it. Elders touch it. And once a year, in the hour just before dawn, a woman in grey lays a sprig of rowan at its base. She says nothing. But her eyes shine with something older than grief. Older than war. Older than memory. The boy at the dolmen, the one with the tangled red hair and bare feet, he too will forget for a time. He will grow into a man who swings a scythe and counts coins. He will take a wife and bury her in childbirth. He will hold his daughter in shaking arms and tell her a story about a man who turned into a deer to escape a king's wrath. He will say it's just a tale. But he will not meet her eyes as he says it. Because part of him remembers. The ravens. The mist. The cold stone beneath his heels. And the silence that once spoke his name like a prayer. Myth does not end. It coils. It waits. It breathes beneath the floorboards. It lingers in lullabies. It hides in the shadow of churches and the lines of forgotten maps. It sleeps in the soil. And when called, truly called, it returns, not as fantasy, but as flame. As blood. As wind. The boy becomes the story. And the story becomes the land. And somewhere, far from the stone circle, a candle is lit in a window, not for light, but for memory. And in the distance, a bell tolls. The gods are listening, frost slicked every blade of grass like silver blades laid flat beneath the sky. Dawn had not yet broken, but the earth was already lit and quiet, aching gray, that hour where breath turns to fog, and silence hums like a memory just beneath the skin. A stag stepped through the stillness, its hooves soft against frozen moss, antlers draped in cobwebs like strands of spun moonlight. For a moment, it paused, ears flicking, gaze sharpened, and then vanished back into the forest. Somewhere beyond the trees, a horn sounded. Not a call of war, nor a hunt. A deeper tone, long, slow, and hollow. The kind that did not summon bodies, but spirits. A girl crouched by a stream frozen over with glass-thin ice, her palms red with cold, the hem of her shift stiff with frost. She pressed ochre to her cheeks with shaking fingers, dotting a ritual circle beneath her eyes. Her breath came slow and visible, the only warmth in a world suspended in sleep. She had not slept. Not in days. Not since the voices began. In the high hills of Simru, the land does not forget. Spirits cling to stone like moss, to language like breath. The mountains here are older than empires, they remember what men try to bury. In this land, names have weight. And silence, meaning. The girl had no name the church would honor. Her father had been a herdsman, her mother a midwife. Her people were not noble, not recorded. But her eyes, those dark, wide eyes, saw things even the monks dared not speak of. The way mist coiled when the dead passed. The sound of a bird's wing just before someone fell ill. She did not choose to see. The visions came like hunger, uninvited, but undeniable. They called her seer. Witch. Druid's shadow. But she did not cast spells. She remembered. Her grandmother had told her stories while weaving, tales in the old tongue, the forbidden one. A language shaped like wind through reeds, like the rustle of parchment before fire. In those tales, gods did not sit on thrones. They wandered, wept, hunted. They betrayed and forgave. The world was not ruled, it was negotiated. Spirits bartered with blood. Trees whispered laws older than kings. She had believed those stories once. But the village had grown quiet. The church bells now ruled the hours. The priest came in red robes and clean hands, speaking of saints who did not bleed, of a heaven that demanded forgetting. The people nodded. They crossed themselves. But still they left offerings at the forest's edge. Still they carved spirals into the wood of their doors, even as they claimed they did not know why. Now her grandmother was dead. 3 nights ago, she passed without a word, eyes wide, fingers curled into the blanket like claws. And with her went the last fluent voice of the old stories. Or so the village thought. But the girl remembered the ritual path. Tonight, she would walk it. Candles flickered behind her, their flames tiny, fragile things trailing behind her like echoes. Each step on the frozen earth felt sacred, not for what it meant, but for who had once walked it. Her grandmother's feet, bent by time. Her mother's, never allowed. Hers, now trembling. She reached the standing stone before midnight. It loomed from the ground like the broken tooth of a god, grey, lichen-covered, and humming. No words marked it. No cross. Only the spiral, carved deep, almost lost now to wind and erosion. She knelt. And with her, time bent. The wind dropped. The trees stilled. Even the night birds paused their breath. Her voice broke the silence like a single note from a forgotten harp, low, cracked, but real. I name the rivers. Her breath fogged before her lips, turning her words into smoke. I name the hills. And she did, one by one. The old names. Not the names given by invaders or kings, but the ones sung in cradles and scratched onto stones. Then she fell silent, and from the silence came something else. Not a vision. Not a god. Memory. The feel of her grandmother's hand on her back. The smell of wet wool. The rhythm of ancient syllables mouthed between spoonfuls of broth. The look in her mother's eyes when she asked, once, who she truly was. It rushed through her, not as story, but as inheritance. She did not weep. She breathed. And the myth awakened. Not in thunder, but in marrow. Somewhere behind her, in the valley below, the fires of the hill fort burned low. Men snored in their straw beds. Children dreamed of saints and dragons. But the girl stood like a reed in windless air, trembling, but unbroken. She reached into her sleeve and drew out the herb bundle, crushed juniper, lavender, mistletoe, and scattered it into the wind. It caught the air and vanished into darkness. An offering. An oath. The church would not see her. The king would never know her name. But the gods, the old ones, they would remember. And when the storms came, when the crops failed and the river turned strange, the village would turn its eyes once again to the hills, wondering what it had forgotten, and who had remembered. She placed her hand against the stone. It was cold. And alive. Not pulsing, not warm, but aware. Like something ancient watching her through the moss. Behind her, dawn began to bleed into the sky, pale pink at first, then gold, then blue. The first bird sang. The frost cracked beneath her feet. And slowly, quietly, she stood. She said nothing. There was nothing more to say. The path back was long, and the mist had not yet lifted. But she would walk it with bare feet, and the spiral would stay in her palms, a shape older than scripture, older than sin. Below, the chapel bell began its call. She did not turn. She walked, candlelight fading behind her, into the morning. And as the wind stirred the leaves, they whispered the old tongue, not as curse, nor blessing, but as truth. The gods were listening. And somewhere, not far away, a bard would soon raise his voice to the sea, not to sing of saints, but of swans turned from children, and of sorrow that could not die. The myth was not a tale. It was a wound. A song. A breath. Still living that a black boar limped through the bracken just before dusk, its flank streaked with old scars, breath steaming in the cold air. It moved with a weight that belonged to more than its body, as if it carried something unseen on its back. The path it took was older than the stones, older than the roads the Romans left behind, winding through the wildwood like a scar. Behind it, the trees held their breath. Above, storm clouds knotted themselves in the bare branches of winter oaks. They were low and full, the kind of sky that held thunder without sound, just pressure, like a prayer never spoken aloud. The scent of rain mingled with the iron tang of peat smoke. In a crumbling broch perched on the far edge of the Western Isles, a fire hissed low. An old bard sat wrapped in a sealskin cloak, his hands dark with age and cold, fingers trembling as they plucked at the strings of a harp strung with horsehair. He did not sing to men, not anymore. His voice had grown rough from salt and sorrow. His songs were no longer for feasts or kings. Tonight, he sang to the sea. The only ones who heard him were the wind, the stone, and a child who sat curled near the embers, her feet tucked beneath her skirts, her eyes wide and ancient. She did not smile. She did not fidget. She simply listened. Once, the world had listened too. Before the cathedrals, before the courts, before the lands were measured and the tongues tamed, the Celts had ruled not with empire, but with memory. They were not a people united by borders. They were a living weave of tribes, Gaels, Picts, Britons, Galatians, stitched together by story and blood, oath and breath. Their gods were not sculpted in marble or bound to one throne. They moved like wolves. They wept like mothers. They took shapes, swan, deer, crow, and they walked among the living. A god might rise from a well or descend in a storm. He might die in spring and return each fall. She might birth rivers with her grief or swallow armies in silence. But memory has enemies. And forgetting arrives in many forms. First came the iron. Then the gospel. Then the kings. The Romans brought roads and crucifixes. The Saxons brought fire. And when the priests came with ink and relics, they did not ask permission. They brought Latin and heaven and shame. They burned the sacred groves, banned the speaking of the old tongue, and renamed the gods. Love became a devil. The Morrigan, a sin. The oak, a tree like any other. But the people remembered. Not in writing. In breath. In rhythm. In lullabies that lingered in the throats of mothers as they swaddled children born too soon. In charms murmured beneath breath while gathering yarrow before dawn. In stories told by hearthlight, never during mass, never in daylight, but always passed on. And the bards were the veins of it all. They remembered when no one else dared. In secret. In code. In song. This bard, the old man, his name long forgotten even by his kin, once stood in great halls. He once recited the Táin Bua Cailnge before princes with red wine on their lips. He had sung of Deirdre, whose beauty destroyed kings. Of Finn Mac Cumhaill, who swallowed wisdom and lost it to fate. Of Cú Chulainn, the Hound of Ulster, who stood against armies and wept for the friend he was tricked into killing. But now, he sang to waves. And the child, she was no royal. No pupil. Just a girl left behind when the raids came last spring. Her brother taken. Her father broken. Her voice gone quiet. Yet here, in this wind-bitten stone hut, she listened. Not just with ears, but with blood. As the bard's song faded into the crackle of the fire, he coughed once, deep and raw. The harp trembled in his lap. He did not speak to her, but she reached out, not to comfort, but to understand. What happened to the gods, she asked, voice soft as thread. The old man looked toward the sea. His eyes did not answer, but his silence did. They had not left. They had been left behind. The gods were not gone. They were quiet. Buried in the bones of mountains. Trapped beneath abbey stones. Waiting in the corners of stories too dangerous to be spoken aloud. And in her, the girl knew, they listened still. That night, as the tide crept higher, the wind shifted. The old man slept in fits, muttering the names of goddesses and animals long extinct. The girl stayed awake. She touched the harp, gently, reverently, and strummed a single note. It rang like memory through the stone walls. Not perfect. Not sweet. But true. Outside, the sea answered with silence. And in that silence was promise. Elsewhere, the world turned. Churches filled with candle smoke and holy chants. Laws were written to erase the past. Girls were married young, and boys died before 20. Bread was hard to find. Truth harder still. But on this isle, in this forgotten ruin, a child remembered. Not for glory. Not for vengeance. But because someone had to. As the morning crept over the water, light caught on the broken rim of the harp. The child's fingers bled slightly where the string had bit. She licked the wound, not with pain, but with understanding. Blood remembers. And so does the myth. Soon, this child will walk the hills alone. She will carry no weapon. No cross. Only a name, whispered by the sea, gifted in song. She will not be called bard. Or prophet. Or saint. She will be called mad. Cursed. Witch. And still, she will sing. Because in her song, the gods breathe again. And somewhere across the sea, in a monastery where saints' bones are polished and locked behind gilded grates, a young man will read a psalter. But it will not be the words that strike him, it will be the margins. The beasts, the knots, the strange faces hidden among the script. And something in him will stir. He will not know why. Not yet. But the myth will find him too. It always does. The door did not creak when it opened. It simply gave way, like something exhausted. Damp wood, swollen from rain, groaned softly as the girl stepped through the threshold with bare feet, her soles blackened by ash and peat. The fire in the hearth had long gone cold, but the smell of herbs still clung to the rafters, drying sage, crushed meadowsweet, a trace of salt that wasn't from the sea. Her name was Ayla, though no one called her that anymore. In the village, she was simply the orphan. Not cursed, not saintly, just unwanted. She'd learned to move quietly. She could vanish into hedgerows. She could steal warmth from dying embers. She had the look of someone who saw more than she should, and who never told. Tonight, the sky hung low over the moors like wet wool, pressing down on the thatched roofs and chimney smoke. The moon was a pale, silent witness. It saw her gather the shreds of her grandmother's shawl, the green one stitched with spirals along the edge, not decoration, but protection. It saw her fingers linger over the hearthstone, where once prayers had been scratched with a bone needle, now worn smooth by years of forgetting. Ayla knelt where her grandmother used to sit, not on a chair, but on the packed earth itself. This was the room where the stories were told. Not the ones written in church books or sung at feasts, but the real ones. The ones only whispered when wind howled through the eaves. The ones spoken with fingers crossed and candles lit low. Her grandmother had said the walls could listen. That stories, once spoken, never truly vanished. They wove themselves into the grain of the floorboards, the soot in the rafters, the taste of the water pulled from the well. And so Ayla whispered now. She whispered the story of the boy who turned to a salmon to escape his enemies, and returned years later with eyes full of things no one could name. She spoke of the 3 hags at the edge of the lake who knew when each man would die, and laughed when the brave came asking for mercy. She remembered every word her grandmother had poured into her, not like schooling, but like rain, falling again and again until the earth drank it in. Outside, something shifted. A horse's whinny in the distance. A crow calling once, then twice. A hush deeper than silence. Ayla rose slowly. She didn't dress as a pilgrim. There was no robe, no talisman. Just the shawl, and a scrap of dried rowan bark tucked into her bodice, for protection. Her path led her beyond the fields, past the ruined watchtower, where no one went anymore. Not because it was forbidden, but because it was forgotten. But Ayla remembered. She remembered the tale of the hollow hill. The place where the Tuatha Dé once walked, bright-skinned and tall-eyed, gods of light and vengeance, buried by time and war and story. Some said they left. Others said they changed, shrinking into the city, the fae folk who danced in rings of mushrooms and could steal your name with a glance. Her grandmother said the truth was simpler. They're still here, she'd said once, with a voice as dry as pine bark. They just stopped being heard. Ayla wanted to hear them. Not for power. Not for knowledge. But because silence had grown too heavy, and the only cure she knew was story. She reached the hill by midnight. It was not grand, just a rise in the earth, softened by moss, ringed with stones that no plow dared disturb. She circled it once clockwise, once counterclockwise, just as the old rite said. She pricked her finger and let 3 drops fall into the grass. Not as sacrifice. As greeting. Then she sat, and she waited. And in the waiting, something shifted. Wind picked up. The sky throbbed with stars. And far beneath the ground, she felt a hum, low, old, like the deep throat of a harp touched by time itself. No god rose. No light broke the hill. But in her mind, images surged. She saw a boy with antlers for hair, dancing through fog. A woman clad in crow feathers, eyes like frozen rivers. She saw warriors weeping at the edge of a dying fire. A cauldron that never emptied. A spear that sang in blood. She saw a battle, not of swords, but of stories. Myths torn apart and stitched back wrongly. Names changed. Powers broken. She opened her eyes and gasped, not from fear, but from knowing. This was not just memory. This was wound. The gods had been silenced not by sword or flame, but by forgetting. And she, alone, had listened long enough to remember. Ayla rose, knees aching, hair stiff with dew. Her hands trembled not with cold, but purpose. She did not speak. She walked. Back to the village where no one waited for her. Back to the chapel where the priest preached in Latin no one understood. Back to the hearthstone no longer used. And there, in chalk, she drew the spiral. Not large. Not hidden. Simply, there. It would be noticed. Maybe scrubbed away. But maybe, someone would remember. And one day, another child would see it and ask, "What is this?" And maybe an answer would come. Not from a voice, but from a knowing. The gods do not need temples. They need only memory. And the memory lives on, in frost, in fire, in girls who listen when others sleep. Far from there, across the sea, a man will soon dream of wolves circling a broken crown. He will wake with tears and not know why. But a story, long buried, will begin to stir. The old ways are not dead. They are only sleeping. And in the silence, they begin to breathe again. That a single candle burned against the wind, its flame swaying but never dying. Wax ran in slow rivulets down the wooden altar, pooling like tears into the cracks of the old oak. A nun knelt before it, head bowed, lips barely moving. She did not speak in Latin. She did not pray from the psalter. What passed between her and the flame had no place in the rule of the cloister. She whispered the old names. Names not found in any sanctioned book, but still carved into her bones like script. She did not know where she had learned them. Only that when the fever came, when the others wept for mercy from saints carved in stone, she called on something older. And the fever passed her by. It was not a miracle. It was memory. In the convent of Dil Dara, the walls bore crosses. The halls echoed with hymns. But beneath the chapel floor, under the worn stones where the sisters knelt in penitence, roots curled. Old roots. Ash and rowan and elder. They had been there long before the walls, before the veils and rosaries. Before the Virgin was crowned, there was Bridget. Not the saint. The goddess. Bridget of the flame and the forge. Bridget of healing wells and poet's tongue. The people had not forgotten her. They had simply translated her. The abbey itself had once been her grove. Her fire had never gone out, only been claimed, rebranded, hidden under robes of piety and Latin verse. But the flame remembered. It burned still, day and night, tended by silent hands. Even now, in this Christian age, the fire never died. One of the sisters always watched it. It was their holy duty, they said. Yet none could explain why it must not be allowed to fade. Some things were obeyed without understanding. The nun who knelt tonight was called Sod. Her mother had been a midwife. Her grandmother, a singer. Both lost to the hunger winters, their names erased from the parish scrolls. Sod had been left at the convent gate wrapped in a rough-spun cloak and a ring of rushes around her wrist. They said she had been chosen by God. But she had always felt claimed by something else. As a child, she heard voices in water. As a woman, she heard them in silence. When the others wept at the crucifix, she felt her heart pulled toward the wind. Toward the earth. Toward fire. She had learned to hide it well. But tonight, as the rain lashed the windows and thunder crept over the hills, she could no longer pretend. She stood and walked barefoot through the corridor, her steps silent on the cold stone. Past the sleeping dormitory. Past the scriptoria where ink had dried. Down into the crypt where even the novices feared to go. She carried only a single rushlight and the breath of a prayer she could not name. At the end of the narrow stair, there was a door few remembered. It had no lock. Just iron hinges, furred with rust. She pushed it open. And there, nestled beneath the heart of the chapel, was the well. They had tried to seal it once, long ago. The new bishop, after Rome sent word of reform. But the stone kept crumbling. The mortar would not hold. And in the night, the water still rose, fresh and clear and pulsing like a heartbeat. The sisters stopped trying. Sod approached the edge. Moss clung to the rim. The water below was black, yet it shimmered faintly, like moonlight caught in ink. She knelt, dipped her fingers in. It was warm. No one had told her what to do. There was no ritual. No rite. But her body moved as if remembering. She drew a spiral on her brow. She whispered a name that had no vowels. And from the water came a sound, not a voice, but a feeling. As if the stone itself had exhaled. The torch guttered. And then she saw her. Not with eyes. But in memory. Bridget. Not the veiled virgin. Not the cloistered saint. But the woman with ash in her hair and fire in her palms. The one who walked barefoot through frost, who spoke to lambs and blades alike. The one who watched cities burn and still sang to the soil. The one who never left. And Sod wept, not from fear, but from recognition. She had not been left at the gate. She had been sent. A vessel. A tether. A whisper of myth that refused to die. When she returned to the chapel, the candle had burned to the wick. Ash curled at its base like a sleeping snake. She relit it from her rushlight, but not with the same prayer. This time, she simply said, "Remember." Not to herself. Not to God. But to the flame. It flickered, and held. In the days that followed, nothing changed. The bells still rang. The sisters still knelt. The abbess still read from the Rule of Saint Benedict. But Sod began to hum an old tune under her breath. One her grandmother had sung to calm cows in labor. She taught the others to braid rushes at Imbolc, though she never said why. And slowly, the myths stirred again. Not as rebellion. Not as blasphemy. But as breath. As warmth. As memory. Far to the west, on another hill soaked with rain, a girl will soon kneel beneath a hawthorn tree and press her palms to the mud. She will not know why. Only that something calls her. A pull older than blood. And when she rises, she will carry the story with her, not in scrolls, but in the silence between words. Because the gods of the Celts do not vanish. They change shape. They wait. And they are waiting still. A scream split the dusk, sharp as iron on bone. Then nothing. Not a second cry, not a rustle, not a whisper. Just the long, aching quiet that follows when a life leaves the world too suddenly. The kind of silence that folds around the land like a burial shroud, damp, dark, and listening. The forest returned to stillness, as it always does. Branches shifted above in soft wind, indifferent. A blackbird sang somewhere distant, unaware. Beneath the canopy, the trees bore no witness. They had seen too many such endings. But at the edge of a clearing, half swallowed by bracken, a young boy stood barefoot and shaking. His name was Danann. He was 9 winters old. His sister had been taken. Not by beast. Not by brigand. But by the shadow that moved through old stories, the one his grandmother warned him never to follow into the woods, the shape that wore hunger like a cloak and vanished when you named it. They'd said those stories were over. That the myths were sleeping. But Danann knew better. He'd seen the hoofprint, a single one, pressed deep into the mud like a coin hammered into flesh. No tracks. No blood. Just that shape, curved and impossible. His sister had followed the music. That strange, lilting tune that drifted in just before dusk, flutes with no breath, strings with no hands. It had made her smile. Then step forward. Then vanish. They said she must have drowned. But Danann remembered the stories. Of the Sidhi, the fair folk, the fallen gods, not small and winged, but tall, lithe, pale as frost and deadly as silence. Not evil. Not good. Simply, other. They were not gone. Just hidden. The boy returned to the village with leaves in his hair and scratches across his legs. They asked him no questions. They offered no answers. His father said only, she was taken. Like the others. And then they went back to their work. The people feared the woods, but not enough to leave them. They feared the tales, but not enough to ban them. Instead, they buried them, like a blade rusting in the ground, still sharp, still waiting. But Danann could not bury it. He heard her name in every breeze. He saw her face in every ripple of the stream. At night, he dreamed of her eyes, wide and stilled, and of a door in the side of a hill, moss-covered and warm, pulsing with soft green light. So, he chose to follow. Not out of bravery. But grief. He gathered what little he knew, bits of lore stolen from old women's mouths, warnings carved into stone, songs hummed by torchlight when the harvest was late. And he waited for Samhain. The night when the veil thins. When the dead speak. When the old gods stir. That evening, the sky turned the color of burnt copper. Clouds moved slow, heavy with memory. Every fire in the village was extinguished, as was the custom, so that the new flame might be lit from one sacred spark. But Danann did not stay to see it. He slipped into the trees with only a rushlight, a strip of salted bread, and a silver button his sister had once kept sewn into her sleeve, her charm against forgetting. The forest felt different. Not alive. Not dead. Watching. He walked until the path vanished. And then he walked further. Thorns tore his feet. Branches reached for his face like fingers. At one point, he heard laughter, not cruel, not kind, but strange. Unhuman. Then he saw it. A hill that had not been there before. Covered in grass too green for the season, its sides were smooth and curved like the back of a beast. At its base, a door stood ajar, made not of wood or iron, but woven roots, pulsing faintly with light. He stepped through. And what he saw was not what he expected. It was not gold. Not horror. Not fire or ice. It was beauty. Terrible, aching beauty. A twilight world, soft and endless. Trees that glowed from within. Air that hummed with music. Creatures that moved like water and looked at him with eyes full of otherness. One of them, a woman, or something wearing the shape of one, stood at the center. Hair like mist, skin the color of birch bark, her gaze as steady as stone. "You are not meant to be here," she said, though her lips did not move. "I've come for my sister." She came freely. She heard the song. "She's 9. She heard the song. And Danann wept, not loudly, but with the quiet grief of a child who realizes the world does not care about justice. But the creature watched him longer. "There is no return," she said. "But a price can be paid." He offered the silver button. She shook her head. He offered his voice. She paused. And nodded. When Danann awoke the next morning, he lay beside the village well. His sister was there, cold and breathing, wrapped in furs. Her eyes blinked open slowly, and she did not speak. Neither did he. He never would again. He had traded his voice for her return. A child's voice, small, fragile, for a child's life. The people called it a miracle. Said it was the saints. That she had been lost in the woods and found by grace. But Danann knew better. He did not need to speak. At night, he carved spirals into the stones near the hearth. He wove circles of rowan. He burned herbs that the priest would not bless. And when his sister smiled, he saw that her eyes no longer looked the same. They were deeper now. As if a part of her had stayed behind. As if the story had marked her too. Years later, Danann would grow into a man who never spoke, but who listened better than any priest or lord. Children would come to him with strange dreams. Old women would give him offerings they no longer understood. And every Samhain, he would walk into the woods and lay a candle near the old hill, though no one else ever saw it again. He remembered. He remembered because the myth is not just story. It is debt. It is sacrifice. It is the thing beneath the skin of the world, pulsing softly, waiting for someone to notice. The gods of the city do not punish with fire or sword. They change you. They ask what you are willing to give. And they never forget. Far away, in a crumbling monastery where monks argue over ink and parchment, a scribe will soon make a mistake. He will draw a stag into the margin of a psalm, antlers too long, eyes too knowing. He will not know why. But the myth will smile. Because someone else has remembered that it was said the island rose only for those who no longer wished to return. Mist hugged the sea like breath from a dying mouth, and through it moved a lone boat, not rowed, not sailed, but drifting as if tugged by memory. No mast. No oar. Just a hull of ash wood and silence. In it lay a man with snow in his beard and blood on his hands. He had no name now. Not in this world. The people who'd spoken it were dust, and the songs they sang had been swallowed by the churches. Once, he had been a chieftain. A warrior. A breaker of chains and of hearts. But that was before the forgetting. Before the gods fell silent. Now he was only a seeker. The sea licked the sides of the boat like a lullaby. No stars above. No shore in sight. Just a distant keening, low and sweet, like morning played on bone flutes. It was not the cry of gulls. It was older. It pulled at him. Not in his ears, but in his chest. A grief-shaped hunger. He closed his eyes. And when he opened them, the mist had parted. There it stood. The island of glass. Not a reflection, but a promise. Not Avalon. Not Tir na Nog. But somewhere between the worlds. A place only the dying or the dreaming could reach. The shore shimmered with crushed quartz. Trees grew upside down, their roots brushing sky. And at the heart of it all, a tower, not built, but grown, its stones braided like antlers. He stepped onto the shore. The air here was not air. It was memory. Every breath brought the scent of his mother's hearth, the weight of his brother's betrayal, the sound of spears clashing in fog. Time folded in on itself. Days became echoes. He walked. Past a tree where ravens spoke in riddles. Past a pool where his reflection aged backward. Past a circle of stones that whispered his name, the old name, the one the gods had once spoken. And there, beside a fire that never needed tending, sat the last of them. The Dagda. Not a god in gold. Not a figure of worship. Just a tired man with eyes like winter water and a harp laid across his lap. "You've come far," he said, not with lips, but with gaze. The warrior nodded. "I came to ask why," he said. "Why you left. Why the world forgot." The Dagda smiled. Not kindly. Not cruelly. Just, knowingly. "We were not forgotten," he said. "We were silenced." He plucked the harp once. The note hung like frost. "When the monks came, they called our stories lies. When the kings came, they buried our names beneath laws. But it wasn't until the people stopped telling that we began to fade." He turned his gaze to the fire. It flickered blue, then green, then back to red. "We are not gods in the way they understand. We do not demand worship. We do not give laws. We are remembrance. That is all. And once forgotten, we become mist." The warrior stared into the flames. In them, he saw his wife's funeral. His child's birth. The war that broke his clan. The silence that followed. "I still remember." The Dagda nodded. "That is why you are here." The harp sang again, this time a psalm with no words, only ache. It told of rivers that changed course. Of hills that once bore names now lost. Of women who turned to wolves to escape their grief. Of men who became stone so they could forget. "I want to stay," said the warrior. "You already have," said the god. But he was not dead. Not yet. He returned to the boat, though it no longer floated. The island had woven into his bones. He stepped back into the mist, not to leave, but to carry it with him. When he woke, he was on the shore of a place that did not know his name. But his hands remembered how to carve. He took stone from the riverbed and etched spirals into it. He walked from village to village, a madman, they said, telling stories no priest had taught. Of gods who walked as men. Of women who bled starlight. Of a tower grown from sorrow. Children followed him. Not because he was wise, but because he believed. And in believing, he called the stories back. One night, under the harvest moon, he stood on a hill with 7 listening children and told them of the island that only rose for those ready to lose everything. And far out at sea, a shimmer flickered. Just once. And was gone. The gods of the Celts are not gone. They sleep in hills, in waves, in forgotten places. And in the hearts of those who refuse to let silence win. When the stories are told, not as fact, not as faith, but as flame, they stir. They remember. And they wait.